Greetings and welcome. Today we're going to be painting this waterfall piece right here, and I'm going to tease the unboxing of this package from YouTube. New video coming very soon. Back to this painting, this one. It's a piece that I did in March, and in March I was in Toronto, I was at my apartment, and it's so much city, and I was craving nature. I was craving these hikes and these long walks and finding waterfalls and all of these things that I loved and I kind of grew up with. And so I decided to create something to put myself mentally there. And that is this painting right here. So with that said, before we jump into it, for those of you who'd like a little help with the drawing process, there is a gridded digital sketch available over on Patreon, much like there are for all of these hour-long lessons, which are also up over on Patreon. There are getting to be so many. I think there are actually over 35 now. But anyways, you can get all of these hour-long lessons in full over on Patreon. There's a link in the description. And if you want help with just the general painting process, there is a link to my ebook Acrylics for Beginners in the description, where it is now 25% off. So go check that out if you're interested. All of that said, let's jump into it. We're going to begin here in the back. I'm going to take some titanium white. I'm going to take some burnt umber. Going to take some Mars Black, small amount, it's very strong in comparison to the other two pigments. Not every pigment is balanced the same way, and some will very quickly overtake others with similar amounts. Then I'm also going to grab a little bit of primary blue. Make this a little bit cooler. It's going to be in the background of our painting. It'll be cohesive with the falling water later. So, now we're just going to begin applying that in the areas in which there will be rock. This is simply going to be our base layer, so it's darker than what we want, and then we'll build up our medium values and highlights on top of it. Now I'm going to wipe off my brush, and we're going to begin adding the midtones. Now, this is something where you have two options with. You can let this fully dry and then go in and add your midtones. Try to blend them nice and softly with the addition of some water, or you can take your midtones now and add them in. They'll blend more with the pigment if you blend wet into wet, so you get more of a combination of the two colors, whereas if you wait for this to dry and then apply the new pigment on top, you'll get a much more accurate representation of what you mix on the palette. So those are two things to consider. Different people like to paint in different ways. Right now, this is semi-dry, so we're going to kind of work in the middle here. I'm going to take some burnt umber. I'm mixing it in to our previous mixture. That way I make sure that we are altering it, making it a bit brighter and warmer, just like that. And now I'm going to begin working on some rock. You can make some applications nice and sharp like that, and then blend others softly with a bit of a tapping motion. And the change and amalgamation of these two effects should give you some interesting rock detail. We don't want it to look too sharp, as this is the background of our painting, but we want enough to define what it is. So I'm going to use the very sharp edge, as you can see. I'm going to try to leave a little bit of that outline noticeable for later, but we could always just go back to the start of the video and redraw it. Trying to ensure that we have a fairly even application of it. Then I'm going to dip my brush in more water, wipe it off. That's a consistent thing we should be doing to ensure that it doesn't build too much on the brush and that the brush is always fairly damp. Here we're using that really sharp edge to move around the trees. It's nice and easy. I like to do a lot of the outlines of things first, and then I go back in and I fill in the middle, just because you need the outlines to be very sharp, and you need a good amount of paint for it. Now we're going to grab our smaller square-headed brush, dip that in our water. We're going to go to our green. We're going to take a little bit of additional yellow, put that over here, a little bit of additional titanium white, mix those, and then blend it softly into this. And in between the two pigments we have a nice mixture. That is what we will use for the highlight on this grass. Now I'm going to go from underneath, that way I can use the hard cut of the brush to apply this well. And here you'll notice that I'm not doing individual blades of grass. I'm just doing strokes like we normally would anything else. And that's because we're too far away to actually see any detail. Now we're going to add our midtones to it. So, we used that pigment last time. Wasn't a bad pigment. We'll make something similar. I'll put it between these two pigments so that I have a good view, an idea of what I'm creating, what I want to create. Remember, it can't be too bright or too standoutish, because we need to save that for the greens in the true foreground. There we go. It's more saturated than that, but it's still dark and desaturated to a point. This time I think we can go in with the medium-sized square-headed brush. And yet again, we're not actually going to be painting any blades of grass. We're just going to be painting in clumps, clusters, and highlights. Starting at the top, blending down with a bit of a tapping motion. Now we're going to jump back into our video with our medium-sized square-headed brush. Ensure that the head of it is damp, as we always do. Grab some of that nice burnt umber. Grab some titanium white. Thicken the pigment. Then grab some Mars black to make a nice dark, rich base layer. This should already be more saturated than that. As you can see, that was what we initially used for the mountains. So this is definitely going to pop much more. I'm going to begin by working around the falling water. We will go back and we will add different levels to it so that when it's transparent and we can see through portions of the water, we do notice the beautiful rock and detail underneath. But this is a good way to start. I'm going to take some burnt umber. This is the pigment that we just used. I'm going to take some titanium white. I'm going to take some primary yellow. This is to warm up the pigment a little bit, augment it, give it a little bit of life. There we go. And it's quite different than this one, as you'll notice. However, when we apply this, it'll be a light pigment over a dark pigment. We'll see the dark pigment through it to a point and it won't look as bright. If we need to change it, we can, but that's my thought process going into this. So, I'm going to begin at the top of our rocks. Oh, that'll be a really nice color. I like that a lot. Okay. And then I move downwards. This generally takes a couple of layers to get the right amount of detail that you want. That's okay. It's quite fun to do. Love adding in the highlights to things. It's so much more interesting. We're allowing a lot more of the darker areas to show through in this rendition as well. So now we're going to grab some more titanium white, some more red. Remember, we're just going to keep changing this pigment ever so slightly as we move around the canvas. So we're going to take the medium-sized square-headed brush. We're going to make sure it's damp. I'm going to take some primary blue. I'm going to find a new place on our palette for it where it won't interfere with anything else. I'm going to grab some titanium white, mix that in there. Now we have a nice bright blue. Going to clean off my brush quite well. This will be for the highlight. We'll take a regular blue for the initial application. Okay? So, I'm going to take this, going to run it down our waterfall. Here I'm just grabbing a pure titanium white from the palette, coming over here, applying a lot of it while it's thick on my brush to the top. Then I'll start dragging downwards, allowing it to blend, to dissipate. When I have too much paint on my brush like that, I just add a lot of water, and we come back in. Now, to add detail in the foreground, we're going to do something fairly interesting, and that's use this old square-headed brush. Then we're going to take some of our titanium white, as you can see here, has a little bit of blue in it. Going to start at the top, going to apply, going to drag downwards. If you apply too much pressure, you'll get additional application like that. So I wet my brush fully, I cleaned it, and now I'm going to come back in and smooth that out with more brush strokes. This is just going to create a lot of nice highlight in the water. Now we're going to jump back into the painting. I'm going to be using my newly cleaned medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm going to dip it in some water as we generally do. We're going to mix a dark, heavily saturated green for the foliage in the foreground. And I'm going to start filling in the areas of the foliage that we have yet to paint. But it's going to be worth noting, I'm doing this right now, not so much along the edges. I'm not worried about the details or the individual leaves that we painted. I'm going to come back in and get those with a much smaller brush. This is just applying the base layer fairly quickly and easily. Now we're going to jump right back into our painting. I'm going to be using the smaller square-headed brush. I'm going to ensure that it's nice and wet. I'm going to go to my palette here, and we have all of this mixed green, and I don't want to waste it. We've used a good amount, but we can take some primary yellow. We can take some of this, so it's darker but it's lighter, then a little bit of titanium white. This is going to create a really nice, bright, vibrant green. And what I'm going to do with it is apply some leaves around the edges, areas that will be receiving more light. I'm going to work inwards to achieve this. It's really going to make these pop down here. We are now going to return here with this medium-sized square-headed brush. Going to dip it in water, ensure that it's damp. We're going to grab some of the darker pigment that we mixed for the back of our waterfall. And I'm going to simply do a base layer like I did for that with our trees. If you remember, the idea is that we want to keep it fairly thick. We don't want to do too many layers of the background for time's sake. We're using a little bit of water to ensure that we get the nice sharp edges that we want. That's why we're continuously going back to it. And we're just creating our base layer. After, we'll put on some nice detailed textured bark that'll really make it come alive and make it stand out from the rock we're currently putting it on. So now we're going to take our smaller round-headed brush, as you can see here, kind of has a feathered edge. It's very soft. It's great for things like fog, clouds, mist, anything that you kind of want to slowly transition in a gradient into the color that's underneath. So it's great for what we're doing here with the waterfall. I'm going to dip it in a good amount of water. I'm going to take some titanium white, mix that out here on the palette so I don't have too much on my brush and I can see that it's fairly watery. And then I'm going to go down to the bottom of the waterfall, cleanly work my way around the edge of the land, and then build up in circular motions as it dissipates. You can use your finger in circular motions as well. Now, I'm going to go over to my smaller square-headed brush. Make sure that it's damp. Grab some burnt umber. Grab some primary red. Grab some titanium white. Mix those up into the bark that we'll use for these brilliant trees here. I'm going to start on the edges, and then I'm going to tap. I'm not dragging my brush, I'm doing little taps like that along the edge. Now I'm going to take that same small square-headed brush, grab some titanium white paint, move it down here, and now we have a much brighter mixture, as you can see. We still have some of the pink, we still have some of the red, but it's a real highlight. We can apply this to the very edges of our tree with a tapping motion. Make them very defined. Stand out from the rock behind it. We can tap inwards a little bit, add additional highlights to some of the already protruding pieces of tree. And then as we get farther down, it should lessen in application, get softer, just like that. Hey there, it's Ryan O'Rourke. I truly hope you enjoyed today's little extra video. It was essentially a cut-up version of one of the many hour-long lessons which we offer over on patreon.com. Over there you'll also find digital sketches of the 10-minute painting lessons, digital sketches of these hour-long painting lessons, and a bunch of reference photos as well. So if any of that interests you, or if you just want to support the channel, go over there and check it out. It is a pleasure to make these long form videos, and I love to share them with all of you. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Saturday with a new video, and above all, as always, stay creative.